My name is Annette Heisdorffer, and I'm from Daviess County, as Sharon said. And I like going to be talking about attracting hummingbirds to your garden. Some of the reactions I know in my case that you might hear are, wow, there it goes. And there's another one. And you might not see them, but you definitely hear them. For our eastern side of the United States, because we have some guests from the West at this particular presentation, on the eastern side, we have the ruby-throated hummingbirds. This is the only species of 23 in North America that breed in the eastern United States. So this is the one that we generally see. It's second most widely distributed in North America. And in Kentucky, it arrives about mid-April, but it has been recorded as early as the end of March. As you can guess, it all depends on our weather and how things go from year to year. These birds are small, only 3 to 4 inches. They can fly at a speed of 27 miles per hour. But during courtship, they can fly up to 60 miles per hour because it's quite an elaborate flight that they show the female during that courtship period, rather than singing them a song. Their wings beat about 53 times per second. So that's where that humming comes from. Many times it's that hum we hear first, and then we find the hummingbird. This is the only bird species that can fly backwards, upside down, and darts all around. In its movement, it can move millimeters, or actually it can fly up to about 500 miles if it has to, depending on its migration. And if it's over water, of course, it has no place to stop. It has little or no song, but you kind of hear a few little chirps. And just to get an idea of the weight, they have weighed males, and it was about 2.5 paper clips. Is that about that 3 grams? Tiny little birds, but bring so much joy. The hummingbirds also capture up to many insects. They use that as a protein source. Of course, the female can catch up to about 2,000 insects a day because she needs to feed the young. And if you can see, 100% of its body weight is needed in nectar every day to survive. They have a very high metabolism. So depending on the temperature, the activity of the bird may need to eat every 5 minutes to every hour, it just depends. Birds cannot smell, so when we select our plants, we don't have to worry about fragrance for the flowers. They do prefer flowers, though, that are tubular shaped, and that's because of their beak, and they have a long tongue that goes inside, it's forked, and it can drink out the nectar of those flowers. That way, too, it doesn't have to compete with the bees and with some other insects. The hummingbird does prefer colors of red, orange, and yellow. The bees do not see the red color, but the hummingbirds do, so the hummingbirds, again, do not have to compete with other insects, at least the bees. So as far as description for this particular hummingbird, it's metallic green head and back, has a white breast, it has some tail feathers, as you can see in this photograph, that nice needle-long bill, and the male is iridescent with a red throat. The female doesn't have the red throat, but its outer tails are tipped in white. The males typically live 2.5 years. Females are about 3.5 years, but through science and some observation, they found some that have lived for 5 years, and maybe in one case, 12 years. So with their longevity of life, we kind of think about, well, do they come back every year? Well, they do, and the females return to the nest from last year, or if they're a younger female, then they may build a new nest. But they build it out of plant material, lichen. The lichen kind of camouflages it. And they use spider silk in and put the nest together with that spider silk. And they eat spiders too. The thing about the hummingbirds is they prefer an isolated or a semi-isolated environment, actually, or someplace that's undisturbed forest for a nesting site. And the addition site is near a spring or pond for water. So sometimes this might be disappointing for some of us that live in urban areas, but many times you can still attract them with some of the certain plants and the feeders that we'll talk about. And especially if you're in an urban environment that has a lot of trees or along a wooded area, that would be beneficial to you in attracting them. Their mating occurs like April, and it usually finishes by around June. They can lay 2 to 3 pinto-sized, bean-sized eggs. That is small. But again, that nest is only probably 2 inches by 1 inch deep, and think of a walnut. Once those eggs are laid, the female sits on the eggs. She does this all by herself. And within about 14 days of incubation, they hatch. Then by about 2.5 weeks after hatching, these small, tiny little hummingbirds, baby birds, are ready to fly. And at 3 weeks, the female pushes them out and they're on their own. So only about 18 to 22 days in the nest. Sometimes I have read, sometimes they will have a second clutch. It just kind of just depends. And in this case, the female, after she mates, she pretty well takes care of the baby birds all by herself. By late July, they're starting to migrate to winter grounds in southern Mexico, Bahamas, Haiti, Dominican Republic are examples of where they go. So when they're coming to see us in about mid-April, and again, depending on, you're not going to move or go someplace where there's no flowers available. So some of these early flowers that are coming to us as perennials are going to be arriving possibly soon. We're getting close to the end of March. So some of the things that are at that time blooming, maybe some of the phlox species, some of the more of the wood phlox and the phlox that are lower to the ground. The Carolina pink is a wildflower that we can use. So some of these plants are natives, if you would choose to go native. And these are by no means exhaustive lists. These are just to get you started. Columbine, Aquilegia, there's many different that you could also get in the red color. And they tend to also self-seed, the perennial, a nice plant. In Kentucky, these are Kentucky plants that we're focusing on. And it will also, with this Aquilegia, melt out, I find, in the summertime because it gets kind of hot. But a beautiful spring flowering plant. Another wildflower is the fire pink. It's a smaller plant, beautiful red flowers. And then there are a lot of different penstemons, but you can see again the hummingbirds prefer that tubular shaped flower. Now they prefer the red and orange and yellows, but they will select others as well. Some more perennials to consider for your garden, and of course those are the plants that come back year after year, are bee balm. Bee balm does possibly take over, but does have many different colors, but there's definitely the red. And and of course, different cultivars. Bee balm will get a little bit of powdery mildew. And then also remember with some of the plants that spread or with some of our natives, it's okay to take them out as far as remove them like weeds if they just take over your garden. This black and blue salvia, I think, is one of my favorite. No, it's not red. It's this pretty blue, but it has so much nectar in it that hummingbirds will fight away the bees. Hummingbirds are just great to watch. And this is one that my father has to sit on the porch. He's not able to do much more in his life. So it's just fun to hear him describe how the bees and the hummingbirds are fighting all over this particular plant in their front yard garden. Cannas are plants that will take a little bit more moisture. And with those particular cannas, there's a lot of different colors and different heights. And again, a long term of bloom. The cardinal flower is nice because it's going to be in that July, August period. So as the hummingbirds decide to start migrating, of course, they don't all migrate at the same time, but there would be plants available and food available for them as they move along on their journey. The cardinal flower will take it moist and partial shade. Really pretty plant in itself. Coral bells. Hummingbirds love coral bells. And with hummingbirds, they are definitely one of the species that they do not have to perch and sit to eat. They can eat on the run, so to speak. And that tubular flower is perfect for them. The coral bells is a lower plant. Partial shade is really good for it. Some can tolerate a little more sun, but the flowers are so nice and light and airy. Daylilies, all kinds of daylilies. As the hummingbirds come, they may also go to these tubular flowers and find insects that they can eat. But so many daylilies, and there are reblooming daylilies in addition. The false dragonhead, pretty flowers, and one that can take a little more of the drier situation. The gay feather or blazing star, you can see we put liatris species because there are so many. If you want to do more of a prairie type situation, you can have those that are taller, 4 feet tall, 4 to 5 feet tall. Or if you'd like more of the garden variety, it can maybe be about 3 feet tall. The neat thing about the liatris is that it begins blooming at the top and comes down its stalk. Again, I did add the scientific names because common names can be very confusing, and the common name I give a plant may be something different than someone else gives that name. Gladiolus, of course, comes by a corm, but with that corm, you can choose to plant and spread out the planting period. It does take about 100 days before it blooms, but you don't have to plant them all at one time. Don't spread them out to give more bloom time and then nectar and food for the hummingbirds. Hollyhock is actually a biennial. It grows first as a small plant. So when it reseeds itself, you keep continually having them, and it just seems like it's a perennial and keeps coming back. So a tall plant, something for maybe the back of the border. Then the Indian pink is one of our native plants. And with that Indian pink, beautiful red flowers, and it can take a little bit of partial shade. Perfect tubular flower for the hummingbirds. And there are some plants that have evolved with the hummingbird that are pollinated by hummingbirds, not by other plants. Lilies, these are many times called the aristocrats of the garden. And there are many different species and types, but again, that tubular flower, and by bulbs in this case. The red hot poker, love its name, a beautiful plant, great tubular flowers, great attractor for those hummingbirds. There are some that are taller than others. So look at these plants, read about them, and then decide if it fits in your garden. Royal catchfly is another one of those natives. The tall phlox will also attract butterflies, but with these tall phlox and the tubular flower is one that blooms more in the summer. A great plant and pretty. Again, they have powdery mildew issues. If you can find some that have it as far as some powdery mildew resistance, it'd be better. But again, these hummingbirds will find other colors. And then here's a wild species of the bergamot, a different species of monarda. So you can plant some naturalized areas. Your neighbor may not like it, but maybe you can do a little bit more attractive by adding some other flowers around it, some of these natives, but you could do a meadow type area. How do we attract them maybe closer to the house or the deck? Annuals are a perfect way to do that. Many of the annuals can be placed in containers. That's what I love about my hummingbird that comes. I have some containers on my deck, and that's when I, every once in a while, look out and see them looking back at me. The Nicotiana, or the flowering tobacco plants, are great for that as an annual. Nasturtiums, wonderful plant, more trailing. I think what comes to my planters are because I put in petunias. And again, I think that's why I attract them to my deck. My deck is open. The hummingbirds don't like to be confined, so they're going to be out in the open area. Red salvia is another great plant to put around the deck or even in pots to attract the hummingbirds. Snapdragons like the cool season, the spring and the fall especially. The spider flower, the cleome, that particular one, some people don't like because it will self-seed, but it can also be considered more of an old-fashioned annual. I remember my grandmother's. But there are some newer cultivars that you can also try that may not have quite as much self-seeding. The height again depends on the cultivar, and it could be as tall as 3 feet or even taller. Sweet Williams is an earlier plant to use, and then zinnias. And zinnias can be planted throughout the whole season and last all the way to the end of the summer. There are a few native vines to think about for Kentucky. The coral honeysuckle or the Nicera sempervirens. Make sure you get the correct species because you don't want to have an invasive species. Make sure you do have some room for these to go ahead and vine on. The cross vine is another one that's great for our hummingbirds. Passion flower is a neat vine that grows many times. I've seen it on fences. I've seen it in smaller gardens in a little bit of partial shade, but a unique plant that we can have. And then the Campsis radicans is great, but it is also could be pretty invasive, so just keep an eye on it. A few shrubs to think about, rhododendrons, so as the birds are coming in early, those will be available. And then the flowering quince, which are going right now. Red buckeye, and this is going to be a fairly large shrub, but definitely a native. And then Weigelia can also be a really pretty shrub, which will come a little bit later. So those are some plants, by no means an exhaustive list. There are many lists that are available. I would suggest that you just make sure your source comes from a university, just to double check. There are many reputable businesses out there too, but also look at some of the botanical garden information as well. Hummingbird feeders, they're fine to use as attractors too to your area if you have time for them. That's why the plants may be better, especially for me. I don't have time to make sure my hummingbird feeder is full. But it's really best to set it out early before the hummingbirds come. Usually the males are the first to arrive because they are territorial. They will establish their territory, so you may need more than one hummingbird feeder. Put the feeder more in the open, not right up next to the house, a little bit out farther. And you may need that second feeder, but put it at least 15 feet apart, but the key is out of sight. Otherwise, they'll try to claim that feeder too. and have many fights. And we don't need to have that kind of situation. So put it around the corner where they can't see it. Sometimes if they don't come to those hummingbird feeders, you can try to place ripe fruit near it. Possibly you might have to set it up a little bit off the ground so that gnats are attracted to that fruit, and that's what the hummingbirds like, and then they'll find your feeder. Just a couple notes about selecting your feeder. Get one that's easy to take apart, that has lots of red on it naturally, that the bee guards are red. Otherwise, if they're yellow, the bees will come to it and they'll fight with the hummingbirds. Perches are not necessary because they will feed while they still are flying. But if it has one, that's just fine. So what do we put in our feeder? So here's a homemade solution of 4 parts of water to 1 part of sugar. Boil this water and sugar for 2 minutes. And the reason we do that is to slow down the fermentation process. We do not want to microwave it because microwaving may change the sugar molecules and therefore make it unhealthy for the birds. Cool the mixture, and anything you're not using, you can refrigerate. If you have a problem with bees at the feeder, then dilute it to 5 parts water to 1 part sugar, and no red dyes. We don't add anything to it because that can be detrimental to the birds. So choose a feeder that has red. Many times I get questions too about what do we do when we have some other insect problems. So if we have problems with bees, go to that 5 parts water to 1 part sugar. Make sure those bee guards are red and not yellow. And sometimes we get issues with ants. So we can put shortening on the feeder or the wire coming down to the feeder, or we can put on a sticky polypropylene repellent. And then we have lots of ants stuck to it. Just use a vacuum that is, you can get it outside and vacuum it down to remove those ants. Or on, as pictured here, is a little bit of a moat device to show how that once those ants are coming down our wire, that once they get to the water, they can't float, so they'll stop. So they'll keep going back up into the tree or where we have it hung. Watch that active feeder. If we don't refill it, those birds may find a different source of food and may not come back. In the beginning season, if you put it out in early April, still don't have any, or the solution just isn't being emptied, then replace it with fresh sugar water in a few days. And then every week or so, take it down, wash it with mild detergent, rinse with the bleach solution as suggested to prepare on the label, and then make that final rinse with plenty of water. The question always comes, when do we take it down, the hummingbird feeder? We'll leave it up as long as the birds are there. The hummingbirds migration begins late July and continues through October. So you may save a straggler who decided not to leave when the rest did, but as that one is still coming through, you will be able to have a food source for that individual bird. These birds do fight. They're pretty aggressive amongst each other, pretty territorial. So again, having more than one feeder is important, plus having more than one area for these particular plants would be good as well. The information today that was used comes from the late Dr. Barnes's publication, Hummingbirds, an Attractive Asset to Your Garden. I also used the Missouri Botanical Garden. I'm located in Western Kentucky. So for me, that's a great resource. An additional resource is the Cornell Lab of Ornithology. If you want to go to that site, type in hummingbirds, you can listen to some recordings You will see recordings there, listen to those, so you can hear the little chirps that they make, but you will definitely hear that wing. I hope that you enjoy your hummingbirds. They bring much joy to my life, and I hopefully bring them joy as well and food for them to survive in my area. So enjoy your ruby-throated hummingbirds.